Welcome to the Redcaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on about old school games. In today's episode, I am joined by the creator of the Neverland Hex Crawl and the recently released Oz Point Crawl, Mr. Andrew Kolb. As you know, no mortal can outrun a red cap, so I hope you can sit back, listen, and enjoy. This was a super fun chat with Andrew that goes into board games, comics, TV shows, D&D adventures, publishing, and much more. So without delaying it all, right to the interview. Go ahead, gentlemen. All right, folks, I am joined by an illustrator, an author, a game designer, fellow Canadian, Andrew Kolb. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm well, thanks. Thank you for having me.
No problem. You've got one of my favorite hex crawls that you've ever created. One of my favorite hex crawls ever created was created by you in Neverland, and you've just recently released a new product called Oz. For those who aren't familiar with either one, what should they know about Neverland and Oz?
Oh, sure. Okay. Both are inspired by their respective kind of like public domain properties, but I tried to add a twist to each of them, and both are kind of like twisted in their own way. Maybe not twisted, but like altered slightly in their own way. And yeah, Neverland is a hex crawl, and Oz is more of a point crawl. Neverland is kind of like a wild, untamed, dangerous land, and Oz is kind of like urban, industrious kind of social setting. So I tried to design Oz in a response to Neverland to try to make it a bit different. Both are, I would say, pretty streamlined. Like I tried to design them in a way that they are functional at the table without a lot of prep. That's just generally how I tend to run games, with like a lot of random tables and a lot of kind of like very simplified information, so that way it's easy to use at the table. I had it generally with 5th edition in mind, but also have stripped down the monster stats, and the general setting is designed for hopefully easily adaptable, or maybe not adaptable, just like translating to other systems, and that's a very long elevator pitch. It's a long elevator ride, but that's the basics of it.
No problem. So you've done Neverland, you've done Oz. I'm hoping for an Alice in Wonderlands.
Oh, okay.
And I'm assuming since you went hex crawl, point crawl, next one has to be depth crawl, right? Although you kind of did depth crawl in Neverland a little bit.
Yeah, and there's a depth crawl or there's a couple of like light depth crawls in Oz as well. So whatever I do next will probably include a depth crawl, but might be some sort of a different type of crawl. We'll see.
But yeah, I really enjoy these books, both for their content, but also they're just beautiful books. Like having them in your hand, they're very nice. The paper is fantastic. The covers are awesome. The style of it is great. Your background as an illustrator, and all the illustrations in the book are yours, correct?
Yeah, and I think that's probably what I'm confident in saying. I'm like an illustrator first and game designer, or like writer second. So with Neverland, you can see the influences of the kind of like mid-century storyboard artists for the old kind of like Disney films, especially like Peter Pan and Mary Blair and the like. So I tried to kind of like carry that spirit over into maybe not the monster portraits. Those I tried to make a bit more realistic, just for clarity of design. But the kind of like, I don't know, the flavor images, I would say, in Neverland are more inspired by kind of like children's picture books, which is where I spend more of my time. Oz, I tried to change it a bit because it didn't feel appropriate in the same way. So I tried to also push myself and went more of like a light Art Deco, is maybe how I describe it. So those were kind of the influences for Oz, because the setting itself is kind of like turn of the century, start of industrial kind of like revolution era. So Art Deco felt more appropriate for that. So, but yes, always a challenge and a fun challenge to kind of figure out the visual language for these books.
Yeah, as I was going through Oz and looking at it, one thing that came to my mind, since you live not too terribly far from the city either, I was thinking it would be fantastic if you were to do up a little guidebook for like the Toronto subway system or something that in that same style, where you've got the districts and the little marks on it. It's great. You have a really good way of, in both books, when a person travels to a location, being able to see what options they have to go to from there. in Neverland, having the little mini hex down the corner telling you where your adjacent hexes are, kind of same idea with your adjacent points and what have you in this book. It makes it very easy, like you said, to sit down at the table, open it, and see that. The layouts and stuff that how you've laid this book out and how the usability is. Did you draw inspiration for that from anywhere, or is that something you've kind of developed over time? Or
so I would say, I guess the general spread layout from Oz is influenced by the layout from Neverland. So I guess as far as Neverland was concerned, it was really influenced by very loose notes that I make and kind of, even before Neverland, kind of trying to take other modules or adventures and figuring out what information do I need to be able to run this? Like, really, it's maybe a little indulgent, but essentially these books are designed for how I tend to run games. So, it sounds like hopefully others benefit from that too, but essentially having as much kind of simple information as possible on a single page. My background is in graphic design, so even before illustration, I went to school for graphic design. So that heavily influenced my approach, or kind of like my way of thinking. Like, I tend to think in grids and blocks of text and going, okay, I need to look into different areas to find different information. Because I don't do well with reading a lot of text to kind of pull out the information. I know lots of people who can highlight, and I think that works really well, but it doesn't work as well for me. So the inspiration for this was just what do I need and where do I need it? As far as the aesthetic, I think the Oz book information design was influenced more by what we were talking about, kind of transit maps and early turn of the century city maps, at least for the aesthetic. But yes, definitely transit maps were a big influence on some of the information design in Oz, which was both kind of thematic but also relevant to understand what stops are we going to and what's at that stop, and how do I navigate around this place in the game world versus how do I navigate around a place in the real world.
And so the like I was saying a moment ago, the books themselves are physically fantastic. A lot of folks in this space go the route of Kickstarters or what have you, but you didn't. You've kind of jumped right in with your first 2 RPG products coming through a publishing company, and one that really, as far as I know, hadn't done a whole lot of RPG products before yours, and the other one is, I should have had a note written down. It's escaped my brain right now. Which one it was.
I think they also do Zweihander. I also don't know if I've never said that word out loud, so I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But yes, yeah.
But yeah, so the company itself, Andrews McNeil, isn't just a super well-known RPG publishing company. So how did that relationship come about? Were you working with them on other products and then pitched this, or how did that all kind of happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, my background in, I guess, more in illustration and picture books specifically, means that I have, over time, I've connected with a literary agent, and she and I work together on my picture book contracts, and just when I have a picture book idea, whether I've written it or someone else, she helps with that. So in the early days of Neverland, once I had done enough preliminary work outside of even trying to pitch it, but just kind of running it, once I had enough of that together and looking at it and going, I think I could maybe try to share this with others. Then I reached out to her and said that this is kind of the idea for the book. She understandably had no exposure to role-playing games or any of the kind of world beyond kind of novels and picture books. So she, to her credit, was very supportive and said, I don't understand this, but I'm going to do some research. So she started to look into it. And at that time, Andrews McNeil was also looking to branch out into these books. I think they'd already done Zweihander, again, if I'm saying that correctly, but they've already kind of established themselves with that, or were in the industry with that, and we're looking for other projects. So because it was part lack of timing and part just being able to go to my agent and say, I want to make this book. Is there any interest for something like this from the publishing side of things? And it turned out there was. So we kind of talked about it. The format changed, a lot of stuff evolved from my original pitch, because I was picturing something very small and not mobile, because I guess the big book is mobile as well, but almost more like diary sized. But they helped flesh it out and make it a bit bigger and easier to use. And they brought a lot of perspective just from like the publishing side of things. So between that and then once Neverland came out, and I mean, I really appreciate it. It has been well received. Then they were really open to my idea of a second book, because I really wanted to do something more urban based or like city based. So that is kind of how it's progressed. And who knows, if I come up my next idea, they might be like, this one's terrible. And that's the nature of collaborating in this way. As a publisher also has every right to be like, okay, but we don't want to make this. So I've been very lucky so far, but we'll see. But that's kind of the arc so far with these books is really a collaborative one.
Yeah, and it's I guess that saves you a lot of allows you to focus on the items that you do incredibly well with the illustrations and the game design and what have you, and not have to worry about a lot of the stuff that some of the other indie publishers had to do with, managing a Kickstarter and finding fulfillment and shipping books and what have you. Having a partner in the publisher kind of takes that whole burden off of you a little bit. And yeah,
it really is kind of like a team effort that they know what they do well, and they trust me. And to their credit, they also trust me to say, like, we believe that what you're doing here is working. So we're not going to, like, they absolutely do not micromanage or push too much. Like early on in Oz, I realized, I think this book is going to be bigger than Neverland will be. And they're like, okay, like, try to keep it within this range of pages, just so that way we can still make it feasible. Or maybe it was like a production thing, because at that point paper was a bit more difficult to come by. I don't remember specifically what it was, but either way, again, they know from their side of things about like how best to make a book and get it out onto shelves. So that is, they trust me and I trust them. If they say only this many pages, I go, okay, I will work within this parameter and do what I can. So yeah, it's been a fun collaboration so far.
Yeah. And like I've said many times, everything is gorgeous on the cover. I'm holding it here in my hands, but the on Oz, the nice emerald green shine on the front of it for the borders and everything is great. And then with Neverland also having its own, very nice cover. So yeah, they did an amazing job with constructing the book, and it was available everywhere right at day one. So a lot of the things that you hear of people, both the game developer and the public that are waiting to get some of these other games through Kickstarters, none of those problems seem to appear here, at least from the consumer side. So it's very, very nice. Do you think it's something that it's if you had not had the background or the already contact with your agents and what have you, is it something that would be incredibly difficult or moderately difficult, do you think, for somebody to approach a publishing company with an RPG book at this point? Or is there kind of a tide starting to turn there?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I mean, I'm coming from a very specific perspective of like, I think the tide is turning, because I know Andrews McMeel specifically is publishing more books and always like interested in finding more books. But again, I can't speak to what the publisher is looking for, but I do think that the industry is changing enough that the right project of the right scale. Because I think what's tricky is, and I feel like I'm tangenting, but I think what's tricky is some of the best projects that I've seen are very small and very compact, like almost like zine size, or they are zines. And I don't know if a publisher of a big scale, like I don't think they'd be able to get zines into like a Barnes and Noble or like an Indigo, right? Like I think that's just the nature of the project. So I would say, my gut is that the publishers will definitely be more receptive to some projects, but I don't know about all. Like, I think it just depends on the sort of project. And it also depends. Like, I think part of what was in my corner with this was kind of the notoriety of the systems, or not systems, the property. Like Neverland and Oz already kind of have a bit of a name recognition. Well, they have lots of name recognition. So, I think that also worked in my favor. But then again, I also see a number of projects that are kind of like completely independent or creative or novel whole cloth getting funded and made. So Yeah, I wish I knew the answer. I would like to think, or I am optimistic that yes, the industry is shifting to be more receptive to this sort of project. I just think it might be a slow one. Like maybe it's like comics, like where early on there were only really specific publishers doing it, and then as the market got more receptive to it, it got bigger, and then made or created more opportunities for more types of publishers with more types of projects. So, I mean, hopefully we can be back here in 5-10 years and we know which publishers are going to put out which sorts of what types of books, which I think would be very fun. And I think good for the industry, because I think that's sort of like competition or just like variety boosts creativity.
I agree with that. On the front cover of both Oz and Neverland, down the corner, we have 5e compatible. With a lot of adventures or supplement material that comes out, you'll see folks put 5e compatible on it as a nod to the 5th edition of the world's most popular role-playing game. And over time, you've seen in the OSR space, you've seen an OSR logo down there, which is supposed to indicate whether or not the game is in that sphere of influence as well. How important do you think it is having that name mark down the bottom of saying, hey, this product works with this system, as opposed to being, if it was just Oz and it didn't have that? Like how does that change in the eye of the consumer, do you think?
It's interesting because I definitely come from a 5th edition background first, finding that the published material, and this is not a slight on the published material, but it didn't do what I wanted it to do. But then finding the OSR and saying, oh, this is kind of like what I imagined like D&D to be like. So that you can see like those influences everywhere in Oz and Neverland as far as the OSR is concerned. At least I'd like to think so. But I also recognize I am still designing this with 5th edition in mind. And while I'm not saying that the changes I've made are things that I think 5e should change, but even just the stat blocks I've really simplified, because for me, again, that's how if I look at an official stat block, that's kind of what I do, is I strip it down to like, what are the core ideas, what are the core things that I need. As far as a consumer looking at it and seeing 5th edition, I don't know, it's tricky. Like, I think based on where my books exist, mostly in bookstores, I think there's the chance that someone is going to see the book or the shiny foil first, and then seeing that 5th edition makes them realize what type of book it is. So I think there's not necessarily brand recognition, but almost kind of like a genre. And maybe that's more how I treat the 5e stamp, is less about this is to get people to specifically use it for 5th edition, and more about, don't forget, this is like an RPG book, or at least for these, because they are based on existing novels or stories, that helps separate it a bit. I don't know. I mean, again, I'm also maybe biased because I'm like making the books, or these books, that if I see something that says 5e, I'm not put off or specifically attracted to it. All I do when I see it is go, oh, this is like a TTRPG book. Similar to if I saw OSR. Maybe this is blasphemy, but I would say seeing those two icons in the corner to me mean not necessarily the same thing, because I think OSR is telling me a different type of game maybe than 5e, but they are both telling me that they're kind of like in the same family of books, or I would put them in a similar spot on my shelf. Does that make sense?
No, it's there is no really great answer for that. Okay. So it's no correct answer, I should say, because it is so nebulous. It's kind of been, I've asked folks all throughout this month, as I've been doing different interviews, what is the OSR to them? And I could ask 12 people and I'll get 15 different answers of what the OSR is, just on its own, not even bringing in other things like, say, 5e compatible or this compatible or what have you. And for me, the OSR one, like 5e compatible, to me goes, okay, somebody can pick this up and play it with 5e directly. And 5e is for as much as there is a times sniping back and forth between the old school game. The systems aren't that dramatically different that you can't cross pollinate very easily between them. So for me, it's like, okay, it's a D&D compatible product and what have you. With OSR though, I found that the name has become so nebulous that it's difficult to tell what that game actually will be. Like, will it be
interesting? Okay.
So if somebody sticks OSR on there, I don't know, is it a game that's harkening back to original editions of Dungeons and Dragons, or is it a independent game that maybe doesn't have any direct connection to the older ones, but they feel like they're in that sphere? So it's kind of, for me, in many ways, the OSR tag has become less of a good indicator of what the product is, and more, it's almost become indie, like
okay.
It's like, OSR stands for an indie genre almost, and then I have to go and find out, okay, you're an indie, but where are you sci-fi, are you fantasy, are you this? It's become more nebulous in that sense.
Outside of those tags, what does I don't know if that's what you've just answered, but how would you describe the OSR, or what do you imagine the OSR to mean to you, at least?
Yeah. So for me, when I think of the OSR, I look at it as a compatible product with older versions of D&D. So if I can take Keep on the Borderlands, that is what I used at the beginning of this month.
Okay.
I said, if I can pick up Keep of the Borderlands and take it to your game system and run it, without having to do a ton of modifications. If I have to do small tweaks, it's fine. But if I can run it pretty much as is, to me, that's probably an OSR game. Or in your case, like when I pick up Neverland, I haven't actually ran Oz yet, but when I picked up Neverland and I sit down with, say, basic D&D or something, and I can run it without doing anything. So for me, that's a perfectly OSR compatible product.
Okay.
That's how I view it. Now, obviously, everybody's got, it's subjective. There is no central authority or anything on it.
Right, of course.
But that's been my view of it. But then there's a lot of other folks who look at the OSR and they view it as they've been inspired by the games that I consider OSR. So like for me, OSR games are inspired by original D&D. And then there's folks that look at those games and they were inspired by them and they've created new ones, and maybe even another generation past that. Gotcha. And so the OSR tag is now several steps removed away from what I would consider it linked to. And that has led to confusion, or not necessarily confusion, but debate, I guess, around what is and what isn't.
Right. Like, does the OSR mean that it's specifically adhered to this thing, or it's specifically moved away from this thing? Yeah, that's curious, because they're so diametrically opposed. Like, it's like, oh, this one phrase either means it's really keeping to the past or it's a response to the past. And I feel like those two are very different things. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, I mean, from the get-go, you couldn't get people to agree on what the R stood for in OSR. Was it revival? Was it Renaissance? Was it rules? Was it
right?
So it's not surprising that it's kind of gone down that path, but it is interesting. So you said you normally play, do you mostly play 5e yourself, or do you also dabble in the other games?
Yeah, I admit that I think what it is I play 5th edition most, just based on what players want, and also just kind of like, I think, comfort. All of the other systems that I've read are just that at this point. Like, I've read them and fall asleep at night dreaming about what it would be like to run a campaign in it. And that's not a slight against my players who like 5th edition. We also play a pretty lax 5e. So I even say that, I say that lovingly. But yes, I tend to, the short answer is yes, I tend to spend most of my time in 5th edition. And when I start new adventures, or when I introduce people, it tends to be with 5th edition, only because that is what they have heard about. Or, if they're coming to me and they're like, oh, hey, you talked about D&D, we'd like to play, then I will ask them where they heard about it, or kind of like what their exposure is. And it tends to be stuff that leans towards 5th edition, or at least I think they're probably thinking about 5th edition, which again is not a problem. That's probably just success on Wizard of the Coast's part. But yes, that tends to be what I play. I would like to get into old school essentials at some point, but someday.
Yeah, I see a lot of design similarities between the old school essentials books and yours, in terms of the way that the tables are laid out and the bullet point information. There's when I look at them, I'm like, oh, it's almost like you guys had went to the same school of design philosophy here. So it was very interesting, kind of looking through those. First time I saw Oz, I was like, okay, this fits exactly with the game system I was using it with. I was like, this is
great. And so, very high praise. I appreciate it. That's good company to be in, to be amongst those that kind of like realm of design. Because again, I really kind of just try to make something as efficient, I guess, maybe like easy for folks to use at the table, which is, I think, something that I really like about OSE as well.
So we said off the top that Neverland was a hex crawl and Oz is a point crawl. What is a point crawl or a hex crawl for those who don't know? Because there's some people that are like, I go into a dungeon and I kick down doors. What's this hex crawl, point crawl stuff? Okay,
yeah, good point. So a hex crawl is essentially an abstraction of a large space. So I will also say this, that I'm not speaking with authority. I'm specifically saying this is how I interpret this, because again, everyone has a different definition. So in Neverland, the hex crawl is an abstraction of this large island, the island of Neverland, which you can kind of like traverse around. And the use of the hexes is that each 4 miles or so is divvied up into a 6-sided hex, which then gives you the directions of travel. So you can kind of like move from a hex to any of the other 6 adjacent sides into another hex, which allows for a lot of kind of like navigation-based role play as well. Like if we're here and we need to get across the island and it's going to take 4 hours for every hex we cross, do we go this way where we might run into this creature, or do we go this way where we might run into this faction? And as players spend more time on the island, they will tend to know or start to learn, oh, we were looking for this and we've always found it in this hex, so let's move over there. So it tends to be, at least for me and for Neverland, tends to drive exploration-based play, which is really what I wanted out of it. So that's a hex crawl. Does that make sense so far? Is that fair?
That's perfect.
Great. Okay. I feel like I'm not being quizzed, but I feel like I'm like, oh, I've never really thought about how I define these things.
Yeah, well, it's interesting until you actually verbalize it. You start going, oh, yeah, okay. This is how this is in my head. I get the nervousness of not knowing if that's how others perceive it as well. But no, you're kind of checking it exactly as I thought too. So
okay, great.
At least we've got a consensus between two.
Good. Okay, great. And I will also say, like, I think the trick of it is and Neverland, it mentions it in the book, and I am very open about this, was heavily influenced or inspired by Hot Springs Island, which is another dense hex crawl. I think for those who maybe aren't exposed to hex crawls, what you might discover as you start to search is a lot of hex crawls can be really sprawling. Like you'll spend in-game hours of travel without really coming across too much. And I like that as a concept, as far as a good way to abstract, we're going from this kingdom to this kingdom, and do we take the roads or do we cut through the forest and things like that. But both Hot Springs Island and Neverland are islands that each hex has a lot going on. So it's very condensed. Like it's taking the entire world sometimes and condensing it down into a small, like, dense bran muffin of an adventure. And that's also what I've done with the point crawl in Oz, is a lot of the times the points can be cities and the connections between those cities are roads. And that's the kind of like lines that you travel between. But in Oz, again, what I've done is condense it down in a way that essentially it's similar to a hex crawl in that all these areas are adjacent to each other, but instead of having the strict rules of a 6-sided hex, each neighborhood you can travel to whatever is adjacent to it. So whatever other neighborhood, or if there's a forest beside it, things like that. So again, it still directs travel-based play, but it isn't as rigid. And in the case of Oz, because it's more of an industrialized city, there's a subway system and a monorail system and other ways to get between areas quicker, where again, you're kind of choosing, do we walk it and spend a couple hours going from this neighborhood to this neighborhood? Do we pay money, just like in any capitalist society? Do I take the slow and free option, or do I pay for convenience? So that's where the kind of point crawl comes into play. And that's where we've been talking about information design, because of the monorails and the subways. There's a lot of kind of like Yeah, you're on I was going to say the TTC. Maybe not everyone knows the TTC, but like subway system maps, where you're going, oh, I need to get to this stop, and how long is it going to take me? And it takes half an hour, so it's going to be an hour. So things like that. So that's a point crawl loosely. Again, how am I doing?
No, fine. I think that's great. And then the last kind of crawl that we kind of touched on is a depth crawl, which there's tons of material out for people on how to create their own hex crawls, because hex crawls have been around since basically the beginning of D&D. Point crawls, there's quite a bit of information out there, because it's very similar to a hex crawl, but just kind of abstract.
The shape's different. The shapes are different. Yeah.
The time and shape is different. But a depth crawl is a totally different beast altogether. And there isn't really a ton of information on how folks make it. I assume, was your introduction to a depth crawl maybe the same as mine, where it's either the Gardens of Yin or the Stygian Library? Yeah,
absolutely. I think the Stygian Library hadn't come out yet. Like, I think at that time I had picked up and read through the Gardens of Yin and really liked that as... And also, okay, let me explain, if I may, a depth crawl, which is essentially a number of locations, and you kind of have three options. So instead of traveling, do we go north, south, east, or west, or do I go to this neighborhood? It's essentially, do I push deeper, which is where the kind of like the depth crawl comes in. Do I push deeper? Do I stay where I am? Or do I head back? And then where you end up next is rolled randomly. So it works really well in liminal spaces or areas where it's not as clearly defined. Like I try to keep it, or I tend to use it in areas like the fairy world, where like the strict rules of location don't apply, or like in forests where it's not about, are we going north of this tree or east? It's like, okay, you go deeper into the woods and this is what you find. So the depth crawl works really well in areas, or when you're trying to explore travel in places where it's not, like a compass may not necessarily be the best way to navigate it. And yeah, absolutely inspired by the Gardens of Yin from Emmy Allen. And then their second adventure or setting, the Stygian Library, also kind of works the same way. I've like twisted it or tweaked it a bit in my book, just because they work a bit differently based on what they are. But the same idea of, we need to get deeper into this forest, or we need to explore these caves. What do we find? And that. So those are the kind of three structures that I've explored or worked with so far.
Yeah, I've been trying to think of places to implement a depth crawl, and one of the ones that keeps coming to my mind, that eventually, maybe if I can find the time to sit down and write stuff on paper, that I'll try exploring, is using it as a method to get through a maze. Where maybe the deepest part of the depth crawl would be your exit from the maze, and maybe there's tidbits of knowledge that you could find at certain levels of it, but rather than having to actually map out a physical maze, doing it via the depth crawl, I thought would be an interesting way of abstracting that out a little bit. Yeah,
actually, I've had a similar idea with like specifically like a labyrinth, where you're trying to get to like the middle of this kind of complex layout. Because again, I've looked up like, oh, how do I do like a hedge maze? Like, how do I, like, I'm picturing like the Harry Potter hedge maze, or just kind of like something whimsical where it's always changing. But I don't want to have them roll for changing. Like, do I go left or right? Oh, that's wrong, and you get lost. Like, it's more fun to be like, okay, do we try to go deeper into this setting, or do we go back? Yeah, I think it works really well for places where, again, it's not easy to just turn left and go here, or head straight and like follow the sun. And so we were talking about, or you were mentioning like there aren't a lot of resources for designing depth crawls. Actually, have noticed the Alexandrian.net.
Actually, yeah, that's what back to my mind. Actually,
oh, great.
Yeah, he released two different articles on that. That was when I read that, I was like, yeah, okay, now I got to figure out how to implement that. But yeah, he's kind of been the only one to put out anything on it. There isn't a ton more, but yeah, his was a good article that kind of got me back into that mindset, because I haven't played Gardens of Yin in over a year. So it kind of, the juices around that sort of a play style kind of faded a little bit, but I want to get back to that a lot more.
Yeah, it's a very cool concept. I'm so glad that Emmy Allen shared that with the world, or came up with it, because it's one of those things where when you read it, it's like, yes, of course, this makes perfect sense. It like there's just like an inherent logic to it that really clicks for me.
Yeah, and it really plays into the whole pushing your luck. Do we continue to go deeper into this, or do we start to back out?
Right.
That resource management, that risk reward of the push and pull of it is great. You were mentioning that you kind of went through at the beginning and went through other modules that you were running and trying to figure out what works from those and what information you needed. What sort of modules do you kind of hold up as your, maybe not from a design perspective or from a design perspective if you want to, or from a content perspective where you're like, oh, this was super inspirational, and like what sort of modules do you have in your top must touch modules out there?
Oh, okay. So I think some of my favorites, and I don't know if these are going to be strange or if they make perfect sense, but I think two of my favorites are Castle Amber. I don't remember the acronym for it now. Castle Amber.
Yeah, that's an X series, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. X2 or X3. I'm also maybe just remembering X-Men. Anyway, so Castle Amber, which I really liked, and then more recently, although I do like the original Ravenloft, I do like the Curse of Strahd as well, as far as 5th edition products are concerned, because I think that one was the first one that really felt like, oh, I understand kind of like what the big picture goal is, but it doesn't feel like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Like it really felt like, let your players do what they want to do, and they can go to the castle. I also don't mean to spoil.
If anybody plays RPGs and has not heard of Curse of Strahd or watched a Let's Play of it, you're missing out.
Okay,
but yeah, I mean, it's especially this time of year. It's near Halloween.
Yes, yeah.
The Curse of Strahd, and there's also really good resources online that can take. I don't know how well you would do it with 5e's Curse of Strahd, but if you took Castle Ravenloft from the original modules, there's resources that'll crunch that down into a one shot, like a 1 4-hour game session.
Oh, cool! I haven't seen that.
Which would be really neat for Halloween. Yeah.
I like both. I like the original and Castle Amber for essentially making an adventure out of a single setting, or like a single, not even setting, like a single location. Like, oh, here's what it is, and I won't spoil too much, but like it may not strictly be just a single setting, but it feels like, oh, we're spending all our time here, and how do you get weeks of play out of it or hours of play out of it? Those were both really inspirational for me, and had like really strong themes as well, or like a really strong kind of you could see little bits of it everywhere, and it didn't feel like we're throwing this idea in and then we're throwing this idea. Like it felt like there's not an internal logic, but definitely like a dense history. Again, like really taking, I don't know, again, this is where my influences come in, taking a big wide world of a hex crawl and then condensing it down to a small island. Like I like a full big dungeon, but condensing it down into like one manor or one mansion. So I would say those two are big influences. And then I think other influences are like books and movies and other things that I read and consume.
Yeah, you've made a good point of like trying to have people spend a lot of time in one area. And one of the things that makes both of your books makes that really fun is that you've put a lot of effort into the factions and the characters that are there. So like the NPCs that you run into, the other factions that are in the world feel like they belong there very well. Like it's not like here's a generic monster type that happens to be in room 53. They're part of the world. They feel like they belong there. And the way that you interact with them really reinforces the setting. So that was very well done. Is that something that you kind of came to naturally because you were going deep into the lore of Oz and Neverland, or was that something that you're pulling from things like Castle Grayskull? Wow.
Oh, that would be a great setting to play.
That would be, wouldn't it? Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever seen any, even like, obviously it wouldn't be like licensed, but I don't know if I've ever seen any He-Man interpreted D&D. Interesting. Anyway, just putting that in the back of my mind. So yeah, monster design. I think because 5th edition or because D&D in general seems so combat focused. Like I know the 3 pillars being kind of like exploration and social and combat. I think I wanted the stat blocks to be as much about the other 2 pillars as they are about combat. So yes, they have hit points and hit dice, and this is their armor. But I also try to make sure I include stuff like, oh, what happens if you were to just like rob them instead of kill them? Or what happens, like what are their goals? Like what are they trying to do? Like they're not just a creature, like you're saying, like sitting waiting for the players to arrive. So what is driving them? And by trying to introduce that into all three, then hopefully it feels like a more well-rounded character. And then for the person running it, can flip to that page and go, oh, I wasn't planning on them encountering this. What is it going to do? And hopefully in that small paragraph, you can at least wing or kind of like improvise something quickly and go, oh, okay, well, at least if it's going to be violent, this is why it's going to be violent. It's because it smells sugar water or something. Like who knows, right? But hopefully gives you enough that you can kind of build off of that. So yeah, part of the influences from the books and recognizing, oh, all of these characters from the source material had layers to them, but also just going, if I need to randomly run this at the table, what happens? Like, are they going to fight, or are they going to initially try to offer help? Because I don't know how many people are going to try to fight Dorothy in Oz, but I mean, like, if they want to, you've got the options. But I also want it to be interesting to run if that is the case.
I love, there's a couple of things that as I was going through Oz that stood out to me. The biggest one was probably the gargoyles. So,
okay.
So for folks who have not seen the book yet, the gargoyles is a set of creatures that you can encounter in there. But the thing that tickled me the most about them was the use of sign language. The gargoyles can't talk. They don't have they don't have the ability to have a tongue or vocal cords, what have you. But they sign language everything out, and I thought that was so well done. And the fact that you gave things that if a DM wanted to, they can be like, well, you got to act out the sign language. It's in the book. Here you go. Like start going through it. Was great. Yeah, I just huge kudos for that, because I saw that, I laughed. I was like, that is immediately useful. I had a whole episode recently on language, and I referenced the fact that the gargoyles are in there.
Oh, great!
Because language doesn't get brought up a whole lot I find in books, where language doesn't seem like it gets meaningfully used enough in RPG products. It's always there in the background. Oh, my player knows 6 languages, but everybody speaks common, and it kind of gets hand waved away. But having a creature like this, where no, they can't talk at all, they got to use sign language, I thought was a really interesting touch.
Oh, thank you. And what's fun about that specifically, because like in the books, the gargoyles again don't talk, and they I think the sign language wasn't, or it's not really kind of like used in the books. Like I don't know if they really even use they don't use signs. I don't know if they use hand gestures in any capacity to communicate, or if they just like attack Dorothy and the wizard. But at the same time that I was working on the signs and the diagrams, I was seeing the Kickstarter for Inspire Isles, which is also mentioned in the resources for the back of Oz, which is like a system for, or like that uses sign language. I don't know if it's specifically ASL or BSL or both, but for magic, like sign language as being the way to kind of like tap into magic in that setting. So it's fun, that kind of parallel thought, but I think both really kind of lend themselves to not necessarily specifically a beauty, but like a way to bring language in a meaningful way. Because I think both with Neverland and Oz, everyone is speaking common, or everyone is speaking the same language, and I tell my players that, because I don't want them to really focus on like, oh, I'm only going to speak Elvish, and I'm going to be like, it's like, well, it's going to be hard. So with the gargoyles and with the sign language, finding a way to have a different social interaction at the table. And then also hopefully the players are curious if they see these creatures which aren't immediately attacking, but are doing the same gesture, which is obviously a sign that the players then need to discover, or like go to a library, look it up and go, oh, this means this. And then go over, they were actually signing for friend or for fire or something. So hopefully another kind of like layer of play beyond rolling dice.
Yeah, I didn't notice that call to Inspire Isle. I'll have to take a look into that. But I've always thought it would be cool. I don't speak sign language at all, or have the ability. Do you say speak, or do you say how do you word that? I'm not sure, but I don't understand sign language inherently just by seeing it. But I've always thought it would be something incredibly useful in roleplay games, because unlike say spoken language, there's a lot more movement and expression, and when you watch somebody doing interpretation on television, you can get a sense of what they're trying to communicate almost by watching their their facial expressions and what have you, which is a big part of tabletop RPGs. But I think we've lost a little bit of that as we've moved to online and not been sitting around the table. So I think more incorporation of that into the game, especially for those who, from an accessibility standpoint, who require it, would be awesome. So just a little bit of a nod to it in Oz, I thought was really cool. And
yeah, my ideal setting setup is someone who's at the table and playing, and maybe the person running it doesn't know sign language, but is following the gestures, because like the gestures or the signs in the book are like based on ASL, or are ASL. So if someone's at the table and they also know American Sign Language, and then the person running it does this, and it's like, oh my gosh, like this is like, I think that's a really fun kind of like either reveal or like a true like outside of game kind of connection being made. And I that's, if that ever happens, someone please tell me, because that's my ideal. It obviously hasn't happened yet. I have players who are learning sign language, but I don't think are fluent enough yet to recognize. And we also haven't come across any gargoyles yet. But someday, I think when they get to the point where we're communicating through sign language, that's the ideal.
That would be amazing. Seeing a group of people playing at a con that breaks out, and a passerby sees that and goes, like, immediately has like a head turn of like, wait a second, did they just do what I think they did?
Yeah. And then being able to impart that information to say, oh, they meant flee, or they meant fire or something, like, right. And then going, oh, okay, awesome. That really helps. Ideal. That's best case scenario. And I think I would love to see, I haven't actually seen an actual play of Inspire Isles yet, but I'm really interested in that as well. Because I am not the only person who uses sign language or introduces sign language into an adventure. So I really want to make sure that they get their shout out as well.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I need to look it up myself as well. One of the other things I noticed in the monsters for Oz, or not monsters, the creatures in Oz, that I thought was really cool. It seemed like it was inspired maybe a little bit by 4th edition of having phases. So as a monster goes through a battle, or a creature goes through a battle, there's different phases of things that can go. Almost like if folks aren't familiar with 4E and never encountered it there, you've probably seen it in video games where you're fighting a boss and you think you have the boss beat, and then boom, a new phase begins and you have to fight through it anew. What was the inspiration for that for you, and did I describe that the way that you were kind of?
That's a great way to describe it, and I would say it's absolutely from video games. Like it's from playing enough Final Fantasy and going, oh, I still have to do another. I have to do another phase, and also, and the reason why I introduced that in Oz was after playing enough both Neverland and just like other adventures, I found I just like wasn't good at running boss battles, or like what I would call boss battles, only because it felt like either it was over too quickly, or they were kind of like just like doing the same thing for 5 or 6 rounds instead of like without something meaningful. And maybe I just like needed to introduce different wrinkles, but I found this way really makes it feel like I think the first time it happens with the players at the table, where like something like, no matter what the attack is, you drop that first phase of HP down to 0, and then X and Y happen, and then the group goes, oh, this is also changing. Like it's almost like legendary reactions, or kind of like, when the enemy can do stuff in response to the players, but on a scale that feels different, also then makes it feel more like, oh, this is like a big fight, or this is like maybe not big, an important fight. So that's where the inspiration came from, because again, that feels very like boss monster. Like I don't know if it's Dark Souls or anyway, like a lot of like RPGs, like video game RPGs tend to do that. So heavily influenced by video games just in general, but specifically in that idea.
Yeah, it's nice. It creates a spot where the players have to rethink their strategy as they go through the phases. What may have worked in phase 1 may not be anywhere near as efficient in phase 2 or 3. And I can see the need for it a little bit more in 5e, where the power scope of your players can be dramatically all over the place depending on what source books they're using and what have you. So, having the phases allows you to have a monster that may be able to equally challenge as many different classes and what have you. Whereas if they only had that single phase, maybe they get, the monster gets wiped out right away, and the rest of the players kind of go, Cool. I'm glad you were able to do your thing.
That's a very good point. And I think pacing is a part of it too, because as it's written, like essentially when you drop a phase 1 HP or like the first stage, that damage, let's say they have 50 HP in phase 1 and you deal 100 damage, it doesn't spill over into phase 2. Like essentially you blast this creature with like a wall of fire, and then they like slump to the ground, but they're not like, they're not dead. And then the next thing happens. So it also still feels pretty epic if you're like, oh, I just like, this person should be dead from all of this, and they're getting up and doing this crazy thing or changing, and now what happens? And maybe they'll be down in the next hit, but at least it feels it gives it one step of more play. And then also for the person running the monster or creature, it gives them some variety too. Like after phase 1, if things change and they act differently in phase 2, then it's also new for them as well. Like they get to try some new stuff. So yeah, my goal is to make it fun, like make a boss battle fun.
The back of both books has sketches that you've done throughout the whole process. I assume through the different parts of the process, which are awesome. It makes me incredibly jealous of people like yourself that have the artistic talent to like, some of your roughest sketches would be like things I would hang up on my wall of like, look what I created.
Oh, thank you.
So when I go through these, it's amazing. It's also really cool to kind of see what the thoughts were on it. I like in Oz, I like that you had all the different cover designs that were on there. It doesn't add much to the adventure, but it really, as a person who bought the book and is going through it, you're like, you can really appreciate. It's almost like having the like a tabletop book of how people have done stuff. So it's really cool to see the process at the back of there. So I'm really happy that you included that. I got to ask, because I've never done it. I don't know if you hear from people whether they have or not.
Okay.
But you've got removable character sheets in the back of these books. Is there a person alive that has ever went and just ripped these character sheets out? Like, who does that?
I don't know. I have provided like all of those removable sheets are on my website. So I know most folks, if they ever ask, I direct them there. I haven't seen anyone take them out yet, but I also completely support if that's what you're going to do. The character sheets are also double-sided, so I'm not assuming that you're going to actually give it to the players. My goal was to both be efficient, but also just for like longevity, take them out and then photocopy each side, so that way you get multiple use out of it. But yes, I actually don't know anyone who's taken any of the inserts out of the books yet.
So, if you're able to, what are the ideas maybe for book 3 of like, is this going to be a series where we keep going down the public domain, really well-known
I would love to. Yeah, I mean, if the right idea struck. So I don't know what I will do next. What I do know, and I think I've said this to a few friends, so there's at least a record now. And maybe I've mentioned this a bit tonight. Like the pillars being exploration, social, and combat of role-playing games, or at least of like D&D. I really tried to approach Neverland with the kind of like theme of exploration, and then Oz with the theme of social. So whatever I do next, and right now I'm kind of in the phase of reading and learning, but I want to push combat more. Not to say like I'm going to make a really violent, mean setting, but I want to try to push how I approach combat. Like in Oz, where I introduce like phases for creatures, I want to see what else can I introduce, or how can I continue to make combat fun. So I don't know what it'll be yet, but I do know that'll be kind of like the main drive, and that's all I've got. I don't mean to be elusive. It's just like I don't know. Like it's just a research phase of like, what do I need? What do older editions do for combat? What do other systems do for combat? And trying to find fun and new and inventive ways to add to it.
I would love to see if there was, regardless of what the setting ends up being, I think in 5e, especially with folks that have come up with 5e, there's maybe a lack of understanding of mass combat and domain level fighting.
Oh, okay.
So like if there's a way that you can swap between, okay, here's a big epic battle that you're in, and then zoom into a smaller, like, okay, now your individual character is doing this scene, but then we'll zoom back out and you can see the larger battle. I think that would be very cool.
Have you heard of Kingdoms in Warfare? Which is okay. So that's
MCDM.
Yes, and so I think because I know that exists, I immediately think, oh, but they've already done it, and I don't want to mimic that. But with that said, there's always room for another interpretation. So interesting. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about kind of scaling up. I think I've always just been researching how do I make that kind of one-on-one conflict engaging. So yeah, I'm very intrigued with the kind of big picture scale sort of thing.
Yeah, it's really neat. The one-on-one, there is so many great options as well. It really depends on what the feel is that the players want to go for, right? Because you can have an incredibly tactical based game. I've been a big fan of if you know Steve Jackson from Steve Jackson Games. He's got various board games out as well, but he published GURPS, is probably his most well-known RPG.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But he's got an older system that he did back in the 70s and early 80s called the Fantasy Trip, and it's all hex-based combat, and it's incredibly it's not complex, but it's more in depth. And I've always really enjoyed how that was done, but it really appeals to depending on what your players want. If the players are going to be a theater of the mind, they just want to kind of chill out and not think about combat as a tactical thing, then it wouldn't really work for them.
Okay.
But if they want to have that more of like a chess match view of it, then it breaks that down really well.
Sorry, what's that called again? I know Steve Jackson gave it. What's that specific game?
It's called the Fantasy Trip.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely gonna look it up. Thank you.
Think of it like an OSR GURPS. So GURPS is heavily inspired. I mean, it's the same author, so he carried over a lot of the stuff from it. But it's a great game. It's one that doesn't get talked about enough. He only recently brought it back. He lost the rights to it for decades, and within the last 5 years or something, he's brought it back, and it's pretty cool.
And designed before or after GURPS? Like before. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, well before. He worked for a company, I believe it was called MegaDungeon, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and then MegaDungeon eventually folded, but they didn't release the rights to him, so he went off to create his own stuff, which eventually became GURPS.
GURPS. Gotcha. Oh, okay. So this is like a proto GURPS, or like a just
I call it the OSR GURPS. It's the original of it. Though cool. Games are very different, but there's enough similarities that you can I can see the family tree here.
Right.
It's like looking at basic D&D and 5e. They're close, but you can see the bloodlines, but they're not the exact same game. So
right.
Kind of the same thing there. So that's what you have on the future for RPG products, but you also do a ton of other stuff. You've got picture books out, illustrations across all things. What sort of big projects, if you're allowed to mention that anything that you're working on now that people might look out for if they want to see more of your artwork?
Oh, I mean, so stuff that's actually out is probably the easiest that I can talk about. But a number of picture books. I do the tie-in books for the Spider-Man movies, which I mentioned very casually, but it's like a very big, cool deal.
Yeah,
I'm like very excited about it, and I've done 2 so far. But yeah, those are both out. I've written some picture books. I don't know. I'm not very good at the plug section. But if you look up my name or Andrew Kolb on like any bookseller site or go to my website, you can see most of them there. I don't have any specific projects on the docket. Like I don't know. It's also funny as an illustrator, I will do like random, like I'm working on some greeting cards and some gift cards right now, like lots of fun little projects, but I don't know if those are any that are worth shouting out at this point. Not that they're not great. I love them. I love those projects, but they're very different. Very different creature. Yeah.
What's your favorite Spider-Man movie of the Spider-Man movies you've seen?
Of all of them? Ooh, that is a difficult question. I really like the Vulture in the Homecoming film. Like I really liked that interpretation. I liked the flight jacket as the collar for the Vulture look. I like that he's, I don't know, stealing scraps like a vulture. Like I love everything about that concept. I don't know if I've seen a movie. Oh, I think no, that's not true. Do you know what my favorite film is?
I was going to say
Spider-Verse.
it has to be the same one that I'm thinking of too.
Yeah, no, I always, but that's absolutely number one. I do love the interpretation of the Vulture, but no, Into the Spider-Verse is my number one movie. And my favorite Spider-Man, I know you didn't ask this, but I'm sharing this information. My favorite Spider-Man cartoon is Spectacular Spider-Man, the kind of like the 2-season run. I always liked that kind of like science focused. I mean, it's still kids or like a family friendly adventure show, but I really liked that they really leaned into Peter Parker as like a scientist and going, oh, like how do I use my like understanding of biology and electricity to like sort out these enemies? Anyway, yeah, big Spider fan over here.
Yeah, he's my second favorite superhero. I'm a Batman guy,
okay,
through and through. But often for some of the same reasons that you're just saying there, I like the idea of like I like it when Batman leans more into the detective side, where you're seeing him figure stuff out. It's less superhero-y and more, just seeing somebody really smart or skilled at what they're doing.
So, what's your favorite interpretation of Batman? Either favorite movie or favorite show?
The animated series is
oh yeah, of course.
It stops and ends there.
Yeah, it's right there.
But Kevin Conroy is my favorite Batman of all time. But of the live action stuff, it's really, there's things I like from all of them. I like the fact that on the most recent live action movie, they lean more into the detective side of it, and the relationship between him and Gordon was really well done. But I mean, it's hard to not say that you like the Dark Knight series the most, if not for the villains more so than Batman, maybe. But
right. Okay, well then maybe my last challenging question, if this is so do you read the comics? Like, do you have a favorite either Batman comic or graphic novel?
Ooh, that's rough. That's harder. That's way harder to pick a favorite there. I will say Hush has got to be up there near the top.
Oh, okay.
I'm a big fan of Hush. Maybe yeah, I'll stick with Hush. The other ones are all intermixed there in the top like 4 or 5.
Okay.
But yeah, Hush was the first time I read that story, I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like that was it was surprising. I think that it was getting the surprise of it. That was good.
More contemporary than I was expecting too, but that's great. I'm glad that like a more recent comic has really kind of left a good impression. That's very cool.
So I'm going to ask you the question I asked, since you haven't watched any of the interviews yet. It'll be great because you don't know this one's coming. The same question I ask everybody at the end of an interview is, you've probably done other interviews in the past, or there's things that whenever I ask you to come on, you had in the back of your head of like, oh, I wonder if he'll ask me this. What question have I not asked you that you would like to answer? Or what's a question that you hope somebody would ask you that you haven't gotten a chance to answer yet? And use this as your opportunity to do that.
Okay. I don't often get asked about other games, and that's fine. But I think if you were to ask me what my favorite game is outside of like role-playing games or like just TTRPGs in general, I would love to be able to quickly talk about how much I love Clue. It's one of my favorite board games, and I know a lot of people don't like dice rolling as movement, like because it can be frustrating if you are only rolling once and you don't get to move around. But I still love the aesthetic. I love especially the kind of like mid-century board design with the kind of like very childlike illustrations for the weapons and the suspects. But I love a game that is geared towards kids, that is absolutely about like solving a grisly murder.
For folks who haven't been to your website, go and check it out, because you have a whole set of Clue cards. I noticed that on there.
Yes,
too.
Yeah. It was like a personal project and just like an exercise in redesign. Yes, I wear my love of Clue on my sleeve. That I love it. So I redesigned the cards just for personal fun. If anybody is playing Clue and they want to download them from my site and print their own copies, I completely support it. But yes, I've always loved Clue. Just like as a kid, I love deductive reasoning. Like the design of it, as much as I don't love the movement, the design of it for that like deduction really feels like, or made me feel like I was a detective, like going, oh, this can't be this. And if you're showing that person that card, then I just like it. It really feels like the theme of the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if you are a board game fan and you like that, give me a second. This is totally not part of the interview, I guess, but 1 second, I gotta reach. Scrap it. I can't get it off my shelf at the moment, but there is a game called Deception Murder in Hong Kong, which if you've never heard of, it kind of has Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. It kind of has that Clue feel. It's a deductive reasoning game where you've got one person that lays down cards for clues, and the other players have to link ideas between them. It's really kind of cool. Have you ever played the game Dixit or anything along those lines?
Yes. Yeah.
So picture Clue and Dixit mixed together.
Oh, great pitch. Okay, cool.
So that would be my recommendation if you're into those games. I've got a huge shelf of board games over here too. My family and friends, we all get quite heavily into board games, and we're a big fan of like the Euro style games as well. So
great. Okay, do you know? I don't want to derail and make this into a board game podcast, but I haven't played it yet. But it's on my like to buy list. I think it's called. Oh, I hope I don't get it wrong. I think Mysterium, and I think it's similar to like I think you're a ghost in a house and they're trying to solve your murder. I think that's right. If I remember it correctly.
I don't know of that one, but I'll have to look that up.
But it also sounds lightly similar to what you're saying with like Murder in Hong Kong. Like it sounds like you're using abstract ways to communicate with the players to again help solve. Murder is always a fun premise for a board game.
It's great. One of my favorite board games of all time is it's called is it Whitehall or Whitechapel? No, Whitehall okay. Mysteries. It's a game based around Jack the Ripper.
Wild. Okay.
But it's got you'd probably really appreciate it from the aesthetic of the game. So it's a big map of London, and all different points around London are keyed off. And I like games that are kind of asymmetric. So you have one person doing one thing and the rest of the players are doing something else.
Neat. Okay.
So one person plays as Jack the Ripper, and moves hiddenly throughout the city, and the other players are all police officers trying to narrow down where he's at and find him.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And it's got a really cool aesthetic and leans heavily into the theme of it. So yeah, check those out.
And that was Whitehall Mysteries or Whitehall
Mystery. Whitehall Mystery.
Okay.
Yeah. For everybody else who's listening, I will link to all these games in the show notes as well. I mean,
yeah, I should just wait until the show releases.
Yeah, they've got this is all about RPGs, but all these other games, it's all inspiration. It feeds into one thing. So if you get big into a style of board game, you'll have that leaking into your DM style, and it sets expectations for players too. Like they've played other games, whether it be video games or board games, so they're coming in with pre-knowledge, and it's going to inform how people approach everything in a role-playing game. Right? You're bringing your own stuff to it.
Yeah, if I may, I was going to say in Oz, there's like a fame mechanic because I think it's important to get notoriety in the city. And it was inspired by, and I was like thinking about it and I couldn't unlock how this was going to work. And then I played Pandemic, and basically how Pandemic works is like as problems get bigger, then they spill over into the similar, like into neighboring regions. And I was like, oh, this is exactly it. But like, flip it, like make it positive. Like as you get more famous, then it spills over into neighborhoods like close by as like word of mouth spreads. So also like for inspired or budding designers or even experienced designers, yeah, play other games because I think that can help inform or inspire new design, like solving like new ways to solve design challenges.
Yeah, when I saw that mechanic in the game, I was thinking of the game Civilization and the way that they handle religion. Religion can build up one area and then start to impact others. But yeah, I can totally see it from the viewpoint of Pandemic as well. That's really cool.
Fame, religion, viruses, they all spread the same. They all spread the same way. There's like a political message in there, but I'm not going to touch it. Just
they're all equally the same thing somehow. But where can everybody find all the stuff that you're doing and projects that you're working on, and where will they hear about what the next book is? Like how can people keep up on stuff?
Okay, good question. My website is probably number one, which is kolbisneat.com. Like neat and tidy. So kolbisneat.com, and I'm Kolb is Neat everywhere on social media, mostly Instagram and Twitter. Those are kind of my two big ones. If you're looking for updates, and they also have like a newsletter on my website that you can sign up for, which is a good way to kind of get like direct updates if you don't want to miss anything. I don't send them out too often. So if you're getting a news release, then it's something that I think is significant. It's not just kind of like I don't know, when you sign up for those newsletters on websites to get a 15% off discount. That's not my thing. It's all just fun updates. So that's me, kolbisneat.com, or just like search Andrew Kolb. I think you should be able to find it.
Awesome. And these books are available in all bookstores. The PDFs available on drive-through? Or
Yep. Yeah, and I think the PDFs actually may not have the character sheets, and if that's the case, if I remember correctly, then yeah, just go to my website and then find the pages for each of those books, and you can download them. I also did for Oz some like basic charts for you to print out if you want to make references for like how does Ozma feel about the Cowardly Lion, like just kind of like spreadsheets. I essentially made spreadsheets. but you can find that all on my website.
Yeah, and it's really good for being able to keep the factions all in line of you
Right.
know who's friendly with who and who's going to react to who this way. So that's awesome. So yeah, I highly recommend both books. Like I said, I haven't had a chance to play Oz, but I'm enthralled by what I read. I have played Neverland. I think it's fantastic. So I couldn't give that high enough marks, and I'm sure Oz will be just as good once I get it to the table. I thank you for coming onto the show. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, hopefully I can come back whenever I figure out whatever the next book is, and we can talk more comics and board games too.
Yes, definitely. Please do let me know. I'm interested to see what the next project will be, and how you handle the combat tier will be very cool.
We'll see. It's big pressure.
All right, folks, I'm going to throw this up to future me that's going to do the editing, and I'll be back with you shortly. All right, everyone, I'm sure that episode had lots of homework and cool things for you to all look up. The links for everything will be down in the show notes. The Child Hero Contest is now officially over. The winners were drawn, and the results will be in our next episode, number 100 of the Redcaps Podcast, with a special co-host, Jason Connerly. Thank you very much for joining in on that, and I'll be contacting the winners within the next 24 hours or so. All right, folks, that wraps up this episode of the Redcaps Podcast. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you are eager to come back for more. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you very so much for listening, and remember, never let your caps dry out. Stay safe, have fun, we'll talk again soon.